Do you do problems?
No.
Never. Let me show you one I think you might like.
Okay.
I know many of you already watched The Queen's Gambit. It was such a good show. But how many of you thought about solving the chess problem proposed in the series? Here is the position. Is white to move and checkmate in 3. So, are you able to solve this puzzle? Looking at the position, we saw that if it was black to move, it will only have two available moves, either king to g7 or bishop to g7. But here is white to move, so how should we begin? If you are thinking of eliminating all the available squares for the enemy king and play knight d8 and knight e6 afterwards, this move would work, but unfortunately it will not be a mate in 3 moves, because after the knight to d8, the king can go to g7, and after the check, he could escape on h6, and you wouldn't have a mate in the next move. This is a force mate, but it's a force mate in 9 moves. A bishop move here will be met with the same response, king g7 and king h6 after that. Let's look again at all the possible moves from black. As I said, they are king to g7 or bishop to g7. So, in order to solve this puzzle and to understand the purpose of the first move, let's reverse engineer a little bit. And let's say it's black's turn to move, and he will move the bishop to g7. Now, the king will not have any available squares. So, if we had to deliver a check, this will be a checkmate. And if black will move the king to g7 instead of the bishop, he will have 3 available moves next turn. And those will be king to f8, king to f6, and king to h6. Again, let's look as if it were black to move, and he will move king to f8. How will this position be a mate? As we see, the enemy king is on a dark square. So, we need a knight check that will also cover the g7 square, so he can't escape through there. The problem is that knight e6 in this position wouldn't work, because the bishop will be left undefended and the black could escape the check by capturing it. So, we need a knight on b7 to guard the bishop, and the only 2 squares available to do that are d8 and d6. But we already covered the knight to d8 variant, and we saw that it wasn't a mate in 3. So, in this scenario, to make this sequence of moves work, we need the d6 square unoccupied. Okay, moving to the next move, with king to f6, again a dark square, and again we will need a knight check that covers both the f6 and the g7 square. And the only square for the knight from which he could deliver that check is e8. But again, the only square from which the b knight could arrive on e8 is d6, which is occupied by our king. And for the last possible move of the black king, king to h6, again we have a dark square, and again we will need a knight check that will cover both the a6 and the g7 square. The only square for the knight that he could deliver that check is the f5 square. But again, this recurring problem, with white king blocking the d6 square for his knight. Now, going back to the original position with white to move. We saw all the possible outcomes, and that the biggest problem was that our king is blocking the d6 square. So, is there a king move which clears that square while also forcing black to move to g7? Yes, it is, and that move is king to d7, the first correct move in this position. Now, if black play bishop to g7, as we said, the black king wouldn't have any available move left. So we need a knight check that covers both the f6 and the g7 square. And the only square that will make that possible is e8. And we arrive there from the newly available d6. And we have a mate over here. And if the black king goes to g7 instead of his bishop, we saw that we need a knight move that could reach the f7, e8 or f5 square in the next move. And again, that square is d6. So knight d6 is the correct move here, and now depending on where black would go, we have a checkmate in the next move. King f8, we have knight e6. King h6, we have knight f5. And lastly, king f6, we have knight e8, checkmate. Okay, so this wasn't a complicated puzzle, but I still think the reasoning behind the D7 move is very instructive. This is why I decided to show you this puzzle. You can also use this reverse engineering part in your games, and found an outcome that you desire, which at the first glance might seem impossible. I hope you liked this puzzle and found it interesting, and I will see you in the next one, guys. Cheers!